Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch is the senior rabbi of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City. Internationally recognized for his leadership in Jewish affairs, Rabbi Hirsch is frequently cited in the media. In 2018, the Jerusalem Post named him among the 50 most influential Jews of the year. City and State praised him as the borough's most influential voice for Manhattan's more than 300,000 Jews. His sermons air regularly on JBS, and he is the host of the bi-weekly podcast I never miss, called In These Times with Rabbi Ami Hirsch. He is also the author of One People, Two Worlds, a Reform rabbi and an Orthodox rabbi explore the issues that divide them, which he wrote with Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Reinman, and his most recent book, which we're going to talk about today, The Lilac Tree, a rabbi's reflections on love, courage, and history, a collection of his thoughts developed over the past 20 years on life and death, science and faith, politics and morality, the past and the future. It was released in May 2023. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And welcome to the broadcast.
It's really
this is
good to be with you.
One of your homes, but tell me about this book. Why The Lilac Tree as a title, and why did you write this book now?
Well, first of all, I wrote the book now because now being really during that interregnum that everything was shut during the pandemic, it in turn is the result of about 20 years of writing and thinking. But all of a sudden, and I write this in the introduction, all of a sudden I had time on my hands, so we closed down, if you remember. And we remained essentially closed for 5 or 6 months.
You're talking about Stephen Wise?
Yeah, till September. Most of America was actually shut down for that period of time. And we were actually one of the synagogues who came back first because I felt it was important to actually be in each other's physical presence for the high holy days. We were one of the early synagogues that opened that year. But once we shut down, I went through the synagogue roster twice and called everybody, and I was kind of wanted to make sure that everything was in order in the synagogue and that I was connecting with people. But after the second time go round, it was clear that we were going to be shut down for a while, and I said to myself, wow, I have this opportunity of time that congregational rabbis almost never have to compile all of my thoughts, and maybe I'll be able to produce a book.
And it's hard, obviously, with so many books out there, to feel like you have something new to say. What was your sense of what was missing?
Well, first of all, a compilation of my thoughts was missing in that I never had the opportunity to do that. The last book, as you mentioned, that I wrote, which was my first book, was in collaboration with Rabbi Reinman, who's still a friend of mine. And so I wanted to be able to actually do it on my own. And it was a good opportunity for me to bring together all of my thoughts that had deepened and become more sophisticated and more mature over the 20 years and had stood the test of time between ideas. That was really what our first book was about. And it was a debate, it was a confrontation of ideas. And the real world, where ideas and values need to actually be implemented in a real community. So I thought I had a different perspective that I could bring to the table. And the Lilac Tree was actually not my suggestion for a title. It was the title of one of the essays in the book. And it refers to a little shrub that I passed every day on the way to work in Central Park, of this little lilac tree. A tree is actually a misnomer. It was this shrub.
Fledgling.
Nobody paid attention to it all year round. I was surprised that it could last the cold of winter. The only living creatures that actually paid attention to this were the dogs who peed on the tree from time to time. But for 2 weeks in a year, it created the most beautiful aromas and the most beautiful blossoms that you can imagine. And I found that to be kind of reflective of life itself. So that's one of the essays, and the editors thought that would be a good title for the book.
So you write, this book is an effort to make sense of what I have seen and what I have learned, to understand better the fundamental values at play in every human interaction, and to apply Jewish wisdom to our individual and communal lives. What does it mean to apply Jewish wisdom to our lives? I know that's a large canvas, but how do you encapsulate it?
So really what our job is, I think, as Jewish communal leaders, and in particular rabbis, religious and spiritual communal leaders, is, of course, we are entitled to and we should be voicing opinions on the key issues of the day, both in terms of what we are facing as a collectivity in society as well as individual, all the key decisions we make. But what gives us a unique vantage point and a unique perspective and a useful perspective is it's not simply one of many opinions that one could have if they were filling some kind of public role, but the uniqueness of the rabbinate is we are, in theory, steeped in Jewish knowledge and Jewish practice and Jewish values. And Judaism has something to say about every issue of life, both on the personal perspective as well as societal level. And so it seems to me that, and I devote a lot of my rabbinate to this, that we do need to bring to our people's attentions what are some of the key moral dilemmas that we are facing as individuals and society. But we need to be able to do that grounded in and rooted in Jewish tradition, and to bring those basic values out in contemplating how to resolve any particular issue that is eventually rooted in some moral question, whether it's on an individual level or a collective level. And even there, to state the value is one thing. To interpret the value in real life circumstances is something else. So different people are entitled to different opinions about what the outcome should be, what a particular policy should be. But it seems to me we need to be first and foremost grounded in and identify what are the particular Jewish values at play, so that then we can bring those values into the public arena and into the public discussion.
Can you concretize that a little bit, just for the people who hear Jewish values all the time and think, like, I'm not exactly sure where they sit in the text or what they are? I mean, we kind of have a sense of it, but can you just give one example of what you mean?
Well, for example, the question of poverty, right? So Judaism has a lot to say about poverty and about tzedakah. We have, when it comes to poverty, we have two broad spheres of dilemmas that we need to attend to. One, what happens when a poor person or an immigrant appears on your doorstep and needs help and needs support? What are the Jewish values at play in this regard? Secondly, what are the policies that we should be implementing as a collectivity to alleviate poverty and eventually to solve the problem of poverty? And in both those areas, we actually have an obligation as rabbinic leaders to bring to the table what does Judaism say about these particular individual dilemmas and the policies, and to try and advocate for those policies. And as I say, I mean, you know, when it comes to policies, reasonable people can differ as to what is the moral approach and what is the effective approach as well. And Judaism is very focused on what's effective as well. That's a big area in Judaism because we put confidence in the real world, and we think the real world has meaning. So that's an example of something. I mean, now a lot of people would sit back and say, well, why is the rabbi preaching politics, right? When we come to the synagogue in order to escape from this political turmoil. I resonate to that, I understand that argument, and I even agree with it in certain circumstances. Still, when I do that, even though somebody might not be in the frame of mind when they walk into the synagogue to hear that kind of address from me, and I fully appreciate that, still, from my perspective, it's not really about politics. Politics is the way we resolve policies, the way we reach policies in the United States. And policies are a reflection of collective moral values. And so to not be part of that discussion is actually to sacrifice the pulpit to other people and other forces in American society that are willing to engage that debate.
So this book is divided into sections. I'm just going to read them quickly. These are kind of the umbrella tent poles. Faith, the Jews, Israel, America, God has sent you, the art of living. I just want to talk about faith for a minute. And you really take on this kind of God versus science dichotomy that in many ways you say is false. Can you kind of drill down into that a little bit?
I think we have a tendency in the 21st century to put all of our confidence, all of our eggs in the basket of science, that science and technology have become so powerful that they in fact can resolve the fundamental dilemmas of the human condition. So I talk about this, Yuval Harari, I don't know if you read his volumes, yeah. So it was really fascinating to me, and and his perspective, as far as hope I'm characterizing this accurately, is to really put much faith in the endeavor of science to actually solve the problem of mortality. And he talks about, if you remember, that eventually we'll develop the technology and the science to continue whatever it is that is fundamental to our makeup in different receptacles, whether they're additional receptacles of flesh and blood or they're some kind of computerized receptacles. And that just struck me as something that was really fascinating, because here you had all of the humanities from the earliest period of when human beings began to think on trying to resolve the question of mortality and to make sense of the question of mortality. Of course, religion, that plays a central role in all religions, and in Judaism as well. And here we're portending an age where science and technology are so advanced that, in fact, the way to solve the problem of mortality is to eliminate the problem at all scientifically and to become, for all intents and purposes, immortal, which, of course, obviates the entire humanistic tradition of trying to address the issue of mortality and trying to find meaning in the fact of mortality. So that's what I mean when I talk about this tension between science and religion. It involves a certain hubris on both sides. On the science and technology, it is demonstrably not true and will lead to negative results to think that science can resolve all of our human dilemmas. At the same time, this literalist, maybe a better description is fundamentalist notion of religion, that science is fundamentally in conflict with religion, is also false, and that certainly is not a Jewish approach.
You write, science, science teaches through numbers. Religion teaches through music, symbols, and parables. Science uses chemical equations. Religion uses moral equations. Science tells us what is. Religion tells us what ought to be. Science is about how we got here. Religion is about why we got here. Science explains. Religion illuminates. Science convinces. Religion animates. You're making religion sound pretty exciting in a certain way. And I think a lot of people right now are not necessarily finding their animation in faith or in religion. Maybe they're not equivalent. Can you just address why you believe religion is animating? Because your book is very much about that faith.
As I indicated before, I think there are very few situations in modern life, whether on an individual level or a collective level, that Judaism has not addressed in detail, and addressed it from the unique perspective of what is interesting to Judaism, which is, what does this say about the human condition? What does this say about our obligations as human beings as well as Jews? And how can we bring all of this collective wisdom to the table to enhance our lives today? So if you believe that the problem of despondency is primarily a scientific problem, then you put your hopes in some kind of scientific solution.
Or medication.
Exactly. That one day somebody will develop a pill that will activate your prefrontal cortex that is responsible for bad moods, and you'll pop a pill and nobody will ever feel despondent or unhappy. And the humanistic approach and the religious approach is completely different. It addresses a completely different thing. It's not about brain waves and prefrontal cortexes. It's about what is the nature of the human condition. And is it always bad to feel unhappy? Do we always have to feel happy? And do we always need a synthetic solution to everything in human affairs?
But just to clarify for those listeners who are on a medication and do feel despondency in a way that makes them turn to an aid, I assume you're not disparaging the idea that a depressed person might be medicated.
To the contrary. First of all, I have 3 siblings. They're all medical doctors. And Judaism says, if you're not feeling well, stop the praying, go to a doctor first, and then pray. So, no, I believe that's authentically Jewish as well. So, no, people, and it's what we should be doing. I know, of course, many people who need that kind of assistance, and they should get it.
You say we are creatures meant for God, and you quote Amos, "Seek me and live." Faith is native to us, you say, and that struck me as actually kind of a revolutionary idea, because it's not necessarily intuitive right now to say that faith is native to us.
You think so? You think?
Well, maybe I just think, there's a lot of cynicism and a lot of sense of like, how does one prove?
But do you think the human creature is less yearning than even 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, less poetic, less in need of emotional contact, a basic philosophical understanding about what this is all about and why I was placed on this earth? I'm actually curious about that.
I do.
You do?
No, I mean, I feel the need.
But do you
and
think
I have
there's
faith, but I'm not sure that it is a given in kind of how we're wired.
And to what do you attribute that?
Maybe just like I'm a neurotic New Yorker around a lot of cynical people. I don't necessarily, it's not that even people of faith, I feel like sometimes it isn't what you're describing so much in terms of how I don't know how faith is visible, but it's not like we're living, even in very deep faith communities, with a kind of a sense of the world as it should be, if that makes sense. But maybe...
Yeah, no, that's interesting to me. It's something I think about a lot, and I wonder about that.
And maybe just because there is so much despondency, and there is so much turmoil, and there's
Yeah.
so much agitation, and there's so much that's wrong.
Here's how I think about it. As you know, I'm a rabbi in a large Reform congregation, so I see, during the course of a year, I see thousands of people. And I think it's fair to a certain degree to say that, what drives Orthodox Jews to daven, to pray every, in the prescribed periods of Jewish tradition, is halacha, Jewish law. It's not that there's not a spiritual dimension to it, but that there's an obligation. And if you buy into the worldview of halacha, Jewish obligation, then you don't ask, do I feel spiritually uplifted at this moment in time on sundown of Shabbat or Shabbat morning? So it's a question I think about all the time with respect to people who are not Orthodox, Jews who are not Orthodox, including almost all of the Jews in our congregation. Are they less spiritual? Do they have less need for poetry and philosophy than human beings in the past? Or are they searching for those needs in different ways and in different disciplines than, say, pre-21st or 20th century? And if my predisposition, I haven't studied this empirically, or scientifically, but my predisposition is to assume, and rabbis have to make a lot of assumptions that might not even be right, but we still have to convince ourselves that they're right. My predisposition is to think that no, the human creature hasn't changed emotionally in thousands of years, substantially. And so, if in fact it's true, or even partially true, that emotionally we have the same needs to explain life, to explain mortality, to explain human happiness, human sadness, but that most of American Jews are looking for it in different disciplines, different exercises. They might be looking at it through poetry, or through the opera, or through a concert. Then at one and the same time, that's kind of a statement of a lot of potential, but a certain indictment that we have huge opportunities to reach people if we can find a way to reach people. And if we're not, then maybe we have to rethink how to do that.
You end the book with a letter to Jews of the future. And you say, in part, it was a challenging time to be a rabbi. We who devoted our lives to the invigoration and continuation of the Jewish people were presiding over what many felt was the disintegration of American Judaism. In our most despondent moods, we felt as if we were living the last days of Pompeii, our people blissfully unaware of the looming catastrophe. What was the catastrophe?
The substantial dissolution of American Jewry. It's something I worry about all the time.
And you mean by that, what exactly?
Through the process of distancing from the Jewish community, through the increasingly post-religious 21st century march of time, that I think about this all the time. I do bar mitzvahs almost every Shabbat. And I think about whether this young man or young woman, when they settle down and when they start to raise their own families, whether Judaism will be important to them, and whether they will have enough Jewish identity so as to want to transmit it to their posterity. Very often of course I don't know because it hasn't happened yet, but there's enough doubt in my mind as to cause substantial, not only worry, but great anxiety. And so I thought this would be a kind of cool way to end the book as a letter to future Jews. It's based on a Talmudic passage of Honi, who was planting a carob tree, and they talk about, why are you planting this tree if it takes 70 years to blossom and you won't see the results? So I was kind of writing a letter to Jews of 70 years from now. I don't think I'll be around at that point, and I was raising perhaps my central worry and anxiety. Will there in fact be American Jews at the end of the 21st century? My conclusion is yes, and I'm so grateful that you're reading this letter, but it's an expression of hope and optimism. It's not an expression of fact.
Right. And you say, my dear descendants, to be alive on the cusp of the 22nd century, what a gift. Your time has come. The entire past and future of our people are in your hands, no small task or weight. Our mistakes, as our accomplishments, are not your destiny. Our mistakes, you don't have to give us the litany, but can you give us a couple? What do you think some of the mistakes have been?
So far, the evidence does not point to our success as a community. I'm not talking about any one particular movement of Judaism. We're all in this together, and we all have some great strengths and some substantial weaknesses. But as a community, the evidence points to our losing the struggle for Jewish continuity, by and large. It's not that if you look at the cusp of the 22nd century and, 100 years from now, will Jews have disappeared? Of course not. Will there be Jewish communities, even big non-Orthodox Jewish communities? I think that's right. I think it will be the case. But so far, the evidence points to a substantially smaller Jewish community, less wealthy, less influential, less educated, and of course less numerous. And so it seems to me that the basic, most fundamental test of any generation of Jews is whether they are capable of instilling a Jewish identity in the next generation so as to continue the chain. And that is unclear in the United States of the 21st century. It should preoccupy all of us, and I want to say just a word about, that's why I think synagogues are the most important institution in American Jewish life, okay? It's not that all the other institutions are not important. Dozens, even hundreds of them are very important, and they serve the Jewish community, without which it's hard to imagine a full and comprehensive Jewish community. But the most fundamental test is, will there be a next generation of Jews? And this next generation of Jews will come from three basic institutions, three basic establishments: synagogues, Jewish day schools, and summer camps. And of the three, synagogues are by far the central institution, because that's where most Jews are either going to end up or not at all. So that's why the success and well-being and prosperity of synagogues is everybody's business, including the Orthodox community, by the way. And they have lots of problems, but Jewish continuity is not one of them. So if we are unsuccessful, there won't be anywhere near the numbers of Jews that we need to get to federations, Jewish defense organizations, Israel-interested groups, social justice groups, and Jewish social justice groups, and so on. So everything rests on our ability to instill enough Jewish identity in this generation so as this generation produces the next generation of Jews.
And one of the challenges, as you know, as is often talked about and bemoaned, is the tether to Israel for this younger generation and the pressures that often abound, particularly in school and on college campuses in particular. Armin Rosen in Tablet wrote a profile of you in January 2022 called The Believer. And he wrote, Ami Hirsch is the most prominent Reform rabbi who is willing to publicly challenge his colleagues' alleged complacency towards the movement's commitment to Israel. And he quotes you, "The leaders of the movement, they are passionate Zionists, but it's not only about what you say, it's also about what you don't say and what you let slide." I want to just segue to Israel, which I know is a very large landscape here, but it's been a clarion call for you on something that is happening, particularly in your movement. Can you tell us what you're getting at?
First of all, the numbers justify our intuition that increasingly, in particular among younger generations of Jews, there is a intensifying distancing from Israel, but also the basic religious value that brings forth commitment to Israel, which is the centrality of Jewish peoplehood, Am Yisrael.
Define that. I just want to make sure we understand. We hear it again, but I'd love to hear how it's defined in your mind.
We're not a faith as most Westerners understand faith or religion. Of course we have beliefs. Many of our beliefs actually nourished the other great religions in the West. But first and foremost, we're a civilization. We're a people. That's the premise of the Bible and of all of Jewish literature.
Wherever we are in the world.
We are bound to each other by, in religious terminology, by covenant. This is the covenant of the Jewish people, covenanted with each other for all time, and as a community covenanted with God. We don't have a personality that received the word exclusively the entire covenant, the entire people experienced the revelation at Sinai. And that's the distinctive feature, and that's the distinctive feature of Zionism, albeit from a secular perspective. The miracle of Herzl, I have a chapter in the book about being in Herzl's suite.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
In
Basel.
In Basel, in suite 117 of Les Trois Rois Hotel, which I think means the Three Crowns. It's based on Christian.
You didn't get to stay in the room. I want to point out.
I didn't realize I could stay in the room. I don't know if you wanted to. It's a really funny story. I'm happy to tell it. Say it.
Absolutely.
So we were a day before we had to come back, fly back to the States. My wife and I, we were driving around Europe, and we found ourselves about 600 miles from Frankfurt, which is where we were going to take our flight back home. So we say, rather than drive the whole thing in one day, let's pick a place halfway and we'll stay overnight. And we had never been in Basel. It was right halfway, so we said, okay, let's stop in Basel, punch in Google what are the good hotels in Basel. We end up in this hotel, Les Trois Rois Hotel, which is right downtown. And I walk in, they upgraded us because in the summer in these...
Because you're a big rabbi.
No, it had nothing to do with that. And I'm not a big rabbi anyway, but the summertime is not busy in European cities except for the major tourist attractions. So they have deals at the hotel, so they gave us a deal, and they told us the room will be ready in a half hour. In the meantime, go have a drink on the veranda on the balcony on us. So we're sitting there, my wife and I, and I'm looking at the view from the balcony, and I'm saying to my wife, this is exactly the view of that famous picture of Herzl leaning over the balcony, looking over the Rhine.
Wow. You didn't realize till that moment?
I did not realize that this was, I even said to my wife, Herzl must have stayed somewhere around here.
Wow.
So I punch up the World Zionist Congress, and it turns out he's staying at our hotel. And so I go to the receptionist and I say, do you know that Theodor Herzl stayed here? She said, yeah, of course. I said, do you know the room number? She says, yeah, it's room 117, but we upgraded you to a better room. So I said, I had never been as deflated by an upgrade as that. I said, yeah, you mean we could have actually stayed in that room? She said, yeah, you could have stayed in that room. So I said, do you mind opening the room so I can see it? It's like she opened the room. She observed me. My eyes moistened. My knees buckled. She had seen a complete transformation. So she says to me, she thinks I must be a history buff. So she says to me, Napoleon stayed here too. So I said to her, Napoleon, who cares about that minor historical footnote? Theodor Herzl was here. So what Theodor Herzl intuited, this assimilated Jew who knew more, who knew more Western philosophy than Gemara, who knew more about, John Stuart Mill than Micah. He somehow intuited that, and he writes this in his diary, and he speaks this in his speech. He intuited that fundamentally, we Jews are a people. And he intuits this from a secular perspective. What Judaism has been saying about itself for millennia in religious language, that we are covenanted, we are the covenant of the Jewish people. Kol Yisrael arevin ze bazeh. All Jews are responsible one for the other. And he writes it as if it's a revelation to him. It's like, and it was kind of like a secular prophecy, where this person out of nowhere, he was willing to buy into the European Enlightenment bargain that was offered to the Jews. Be a Jew at your home, be a good Austrian, a good French citizen, and we'll leave you alone. And that's the solution to the Jewish problem being the problem of anti-Semitism. And Herzl was, and most of his compatriots in Western Europe for sure, were willing to buy that. It's only when he concluded, he happened to be in Paris during the Dreyfus trial, that too was not, it wasn't the solution, because because there was something fundamentally irrational about anti-Semitism. And therefore the Age of Reason couldn't solve the problem of anti-Semitism because it wasn't a problem that was rooted in reason. He then concludes, at one and the same time, something so optimistic that they thought he was a madman, and so pessimistic that it essentially advocated a mass departure of Jews from the cradle of the Enlightenment. He says, we can create a Jewish state. He even writes it, in 50 years, if we want it, we can create a Jewish state, which was a sign to most observers that immediately thereafter that this man was a lunatic, that he was crazy. But at the same time, it expressed a fundamental rejection of the Enlightenment as the vehicle to solve the Jewish problem. And he understands that the only way to save the Jews, the only way to solve the Jewish problem, is to get out of the way. To get out of the way even of the Enlightenment. And of course, that's why most Jews at the time, certainly in the West, opposed Zionism. But very quickly, in historical terms, that turned around very quickly and instantly, really within a year, among some Jewish populations, especially the Jewish populations of the East, because they understood true anti-Semitism in their kishkes. All you had to do was take a look outside, see that the Zionist analysis was right. The Enlightenment will not solve the Jewish problem, and then of course with the rise of fascism and the unfolding of the 20th century, the Zionists, they weren't necessarily right about everything, but they were certainly right about this. And while nobody could really predict the dimensions of the Holocaust, they did intuit better than others that if the Jews didn't get out of the way, both spiritually as well as physically, Europe posed a unique threat to the future of the Jewish people.
And so to fast forward and bring you back again to the issue of the Israel connection or lack of it right now. And what you have said, I think, is that we're in a way in the reform movement ceding to the criticism in a way that kind of takes us away from the core of what we should be standing for. Can you just address why that has become, I think, one of the cornerstones of your rabbinate right now?
First of all, I believe in criticism. That's what Jews do.
Of Israel.
Of every government and every policy.
Right.
That's fundamental to Judaism. Not only, in my mind, is criticism of any particular Israeli government to be discouraged. To the contrary. It's the sign of health and vitality. It's a good thing.
And
Jews
you've
should
done
be
it,
involved.
I want to point out.
And I've done it too, many times. But I make a distinction between criticism of this or that policy and rejection of the Zionist enterprise itself. And rejection of the Zionist enterprise is offensive to me first of all, on an emotional level, but I think it's a contradiction of the essential Jewish value of all Jews being responsible one for the other, and our community being rooted in Jewish civilization and Jewish peoplehood. And so it's deeply worrying that there is a drift, and it's being felt most intensely amongst the liberal American Jewish community. And the younger you go, the more intense that phenomenon is.
And why do you think the liberal Jewish community is particularly vulnerable to this or susceptible to this?
First of all, I think just on a question of policies, Israeli policies, in particular this government at this point in time, the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian dispute raises moral dilemmas that are troubling to American Jews, and in particular younger American Jews, and they should be troubling to younger American Jews. But I think that's a fairly marginal reason. I don't denigrate that. I don't deny that that's in play. I don't think that's the main reason. I think the main reason is what we in the movement saw in the end of the 19th century, which is why we rejected Zionism. It wasn't because, oh, this wasn't practical and so on. We were already on record as being opposed to Jewish peoplehood, which was the truly radical statement of American liberal Jews of the 19th century.
And because of the particularism versus universalism idea?
Right. That the way to approach the realization of the Messianic era, this is how we phrased it in the 19th century.
Through a universalistic lens.
Is through the Enlightenment. Okay, and this is kind of a bit of the irony here, because American Reform Jews were the most nationalistic Jews you could find. The only nationalism that they opposed was Jewish nationalism. They felt that America was the beacon of salvation. In fact, there were slogans that said, Charleston is our Jerusalem. There was a big Jewish community at Charleston back in the 19th century. Charleston is our Jerusalem, and America is our Zion. So they rejected the whole concept of Jewish peoplehood, and when Zionism came on the scene 10 years later, or 12 years later, already being on record as being opposed to Jewish peoplehood, they of course were opposed to politicized Jewish peoplehood, especially since it came from mostly secular ideologues like Herzl and his compatriots. And it took me a long time to figure out, I think I'm right about this. Again, I haven't studied this empirically, but I was the director for 12 years of the Association of Reform Zionists of America, of ARTSA. I was in the heart of the reform establishment. On a
I should
national,
point out that you also served. Do you want to just say a word about that?
in the IDF.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had moved to Israel with my parents and finished high school in the military, went to law school, and eventually ended up in rabbinical school here. I was in the heart of the Reform Jewish establishment, and I had assumed that this period of Reform Jewish history, and I say not only Reform because it encapsulates diaspora liberal Jews, okay, that I had assumed that this part of our history was forever relegated to the ash heaps of history, to a footnote, an interesting footnote.
Which part was relegated? Just to be
This
clear.
rejection of Jewish peoplehood and the elevation of universalism, not as an outgrowth or as an expression or a reflection of Jewish peoplehood, but as its replacement. And it began to dawn on me for lots of reasons that, I don't really need to go into in detail here, but it began to dawn on me actually that I think I was wrong about that. It took me 30 years of my career to conclude that all of these assumptions that I made about this being part of the past and it's not going to return were, I think, misjudged. I'm not saying completely wrong, but misjudged and misguided, because what I concluded was that actually what was exceptional was not this brief period of time that the Reform movement was anti-Zionist or liberal American Jews were anti-Zionist. What the exception was the 20th century that imposed existential threat after existential threat on our people, beginning at the beginning of the century with the pogroms in Eastern Europe, the rise of fascism, the Holocaust, the struggle for Israeli independence, the Six-Day War, the 73 War, to a certain degree, although lesser, the struggle to free Soviet Jewry. All of these issues brought even universalist Jews into the embrace of Jewish peoplehood because of the existential threats against our people. But there have been two generations now that have been born perceiving no existential threat against the Jewish people. The distressing rise of anti-Semitism in our country notwithstanding. And if anything, they look at Israel as the neighborhood bully. And we are going back to what I think now is the default position of liberalism, Jewish liberalism in the West, which is a rejection of particularism in favor of universalism, not the exquisite blend that Judaism has offered the world for 3,000 years, or say 2,000 years.
You said on the AJC's podcast with Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank, you said, we are susceptible to emphasizing universal values, not as an expression of Jewish peoplehood, but at the expense of Jewish peoplehood. Both need to exist to express authentic Judaism. If someone wanted to be simplistic and say, Ammiel Hirsch is basically saying, we need to just focus more on ourselves, on other Jews. How is that unfair? Like, how do you push back on that?
Right. Well, first of all, that's not what you read.
Right. But you can imagine. You know I'm channeling, not myself, but others who say, he's basically saying, care less about the world and more about your own.
Yeah. That's not what I'm saying. I believe that one of the unique contributions that Jews have given the world, including the Western world, is the exquisite balance between concern for all the families of the earth, rooted in the unique particularism of the Jewish people. We see that from the very beginning of Judaism, the very first words of Judaism. When God selects Abraham, God says to Abraham, I have selected you, I have chosen you, you shall be a blessing, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves through you. Right there and then, at the very beginning of Judaism, you have the basic framework of how Jews see themselves and how they see their contribution to the world. We are a family that has responsibilities for all the families of the earth. It's for that reason that God says several chapters later to himself, basically, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, which is to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, the two non-Jewish cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the response is, how can I hide this from him? Because I've selected him to do what is just and right. We see the same dynamic, by the way, in the Haftarah portion on Yom Kippur that we read with in the book of Jonah. That we have here a Jewish prophet who's been called to the Gentile city to call on them to repent from their ways. And he seeks to avoid that responsibility. Of course, the upshot of this story is Jews can't avoid the responsibility to preach justice and righteousness to the entire world, to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And so to take one of these elements and to remove them, or to so emphasize the other element that it in effect eliminates the balance, is to distort Judaism on both ends. To care only about universal values and not the Jewish people is a distortion of Judaism. To care only about the Jewish people, and we have those Jews in our community too, and who care nothing about human suffering anywhere else, is also a distortion of Judaism. That's why I said in one of the speeches I gave recently that you listened to, universalism that's not grounded in Jewish particularism is not Jewish universalism. It's just universalism. It's more Mill than Micah, more Kant than Kiddushim.
So you are alluding to this conference that at the time we're talking recently happened in your synagogue called Re-CHARGING Reform Judaism, or just Judaism?
Yes, Reform
Judaism. And you gave a very challenging speech. I encourage people to watch it. And in it you said, we are the leaders. We must lead. We must be proactive. We must aggressively counter intensifying and expanding anti-Zionist, anti-peoplehood forces in liberal spaces throughout the Western world. And I'm jumping ahead just a few lines. We cannot march arm in arm with Israel haters, lending them our moral authority and confusing our own followers. We must oppose them, and we must let everyone know why we cannot join them. You have stood very publicly, not against, but in challenge of your own movement. And some would say that that's not something we do, is kind of challenge our own family in that way. Why do you think that it was such an urgent moment you needed to? And what is this conference about?
Somebody's got to do it, right? If that's what we believe. And this is not coming out in a strong enough way, and people aren't hearing us, our own people, as well as the
our own
American,
people, meaning congregants,
American Jews, our own congregants, as well as our allies with whom we agree on so many things, and we have overlapping opinions, but not on everything. Certainly not with respect to Israel or anti-Semitism in all cases. So if we are losing ground in this respect, this is a mortal threat to the idea of liberal Jewish values, because most American Jews, they will those who care. We talked about the challenges of Jewish continuity, and if we don't implant enough Jewish identity in this generation, in 2 generations, there won't be Jews in that family at all. But for those who do still care, if we simply let slide this detachment from Jewish peoplehood, from Israel, a perception that we are primarily a political organization, sticking some Jewish slogans on our policies, as opposed to a religious organization, a religious movement, which is what we are, that derives its understanding of our political obligations and our policy obligations from Jewish values. And if we are distancing from fundamental Jewish values, in many cases the question of Jewish particularism, and it's reflected in our sensitivity to anti-Semitism amongst our potential allies. I'll give you an example in a second. Then somebody's got to say up and say it. And my own perspective, again, I haven't investigated it empirically, but intuitively in my congregation, and I believe this to be the case throughout the movement, most of our people agree with my perspective, with what I'm telling you. They're uncomfortable with abandoning Israel. They're uncomfortable with ideologies that look at the world through the lens of race alone. They realize that there are potential negative effects on the American Jewish community and on individual Jews. We need to stand up and clarify our values.
And
even if, just a second, Abby,
Yeah.
even if we disagree on the nuance or the ramification of the central values, as I said at the beginning, that's completely legitimate and appropriate. So what? So what if there's some in our movement who believe these are the ramifications of our values, and others believe something different, and we have what's called in Judaism a machloket, right? A disagreement or disputation. All of Judaism is based on that. That's a good thing.
And your colleagues or your fellow clergy in this movement, I'm not asking you to recount exact conversations, but what have the conversations been like since you've been more outspoken about this?
So, we tend to hear either from people who violently oppose us. Or agree. It, in any case, is not empirical. There's no way to know. Of course, I get a lot of support from people who have said, finally, there is somebody who's clarifying our values as we understand them. And the implicit critique that maybe, we have departed from those values in some manner. I'll give you an example that I wanted to say before. I don't know what you feel about this. We marched if you remember the women's marches after the elections in 2016. So we marched for 2 years with the Women's March. It was a bit complicated because it ended up to be a couple of organizations who claimed the name of Women's March and different chapters and so on. But when it became clear to us that even though there was from our perspective as a Reform Jewish community, there was a significant overlap in our concerns for women's rights. And the women's marches were not only about women's rights, they were basically about concern of what the Trump era would bring.
Right.
And we shared those concerns strongly. But when it became clear to us after 2 years that the leaders of the Women's March expelled American Jews, and in particular liberal Zionist Jews, and there was disturbing connection between some of the leaders and BDS, as well as supporters of Farrakhan, we concluded there's no way that we're going to march. And that should have been, in my view, that should have been the policy of all Reform synagogues. So I got up and I said it because nobody else said it. Are synagogues and other colleagues entitled to disagree with my conclusion? Of course.
So I want to give you the last word in terms of bringing us back to this book. Many of the issues you've been talking about are woven through. What do you hope this book does, or how do you hope people read it?
I hope they read it, first of all, not necessarily in order, although there's nothing wrong in reading it in order. Just, there's not one theme through the book. So it's not, here's my thesis and I'm going to spend the book proving my thesis. It's a series of reflections on some of what I consider to be the deepest, most important issues of our lives as individuals and as a community, and to cause people to reflect and to think, and to do it in a context of Jewish values. So I haven't done exhaustive research from a Jewish perspective on what Judaism says about this particular chapter, this particular issue, but I have done some that might be enlightening to people who care about what Judaism says about the issues of the day. And what we'll find is we're not the first generation to care about these issues.
There's a good inheritance. The book is The Lilac Tree by Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch. Thank you so much for this time. I encourage you to listen to his podcast called In These Times with Ammiel Hirsch. Thank you for being with us on In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin, and I look forward to seeing you next time.